Not a sound had passed her lips since the night her world fractured in the courtroom. Her stillness held the power to decide a dangerous man's destiny. But as she gave a nearly invisible signal to her dog, an entirely unexpected event unfolded. The judge struck the gavel, halting the session. Subscribe to ensure you never miss new sagas, and share in the comments where you are watching from. The town of Havenwood, cradled in the green heart of the Carolinas, was the kind of place where transformation arrived like a slow tide, where familiar faces exchanged greetings year upon endless year, and where the fragrance of pine and honeysuckle always hung in the air. It was a town of serene streets and deeply woven family ties, a place where everyone knew their neighbors and where children's laughter echoed under the gentle watch of their elders. But in the last month, a profound shift had occurred in the Reed household. The comforting warmth that once radiated through their home had been supplanted by a deeply unsettling silence, a quiet that clung to the very walls like a persistent shadow. 7-year-old Aria Reed had always been a spirit of pure life, her laughter a vibrant melody that would cascade through the house as she played in the backyard. Twirling without shoes on the lush green carpet of grass, she had a unique gift for filling the smallest corners with her boundless energy, a sweet habit of murmuring to herself as she drew or whispering epic tales to her stuffed companions before sleep. She had never been a child who feared the dark, never paused before sprinting to the edge of the driveway at the cheerful jingle of the ice cream truck as it wound its way down their street. But now, everything was different. A month ago, something had taken place inside their home, something that had cruelly stolen Aria's voice. Her mother, Serafina Reed, remembered that night with a crystalline clarity that sent a cold wave of dread through her. She had come back late from her shift at the hospital, stepping into the hushed house fully expecting to find her daughter sound asleep. Instead, she had discovered the front door was slightly ajar, the lock disengaged. Her heart had surged into her throat as she desperately rushed inside, calling out Aria's name. She located her daughter minutes later, tucked away inside the bedroom closet, curled into a shivering ball, her arms cinched tightly around her knees. She had tried to gently coax the girl to speak, had held her in a tight embrace and whispered soft reassurances, but Aria had only stared right through her with wide, empty eyes. She would not reveal what had transpired. She would not say who had been there. The police had soon arrived, carefully combing through the residence for any sign of forced entry, for anything at all missing or disturbed. But there was absolutely nothing. No shattered windows, no telltale footprints on the floor, no indication that another soul had been inside. Nothing had been taken, and there was no shred of evidence pointing to an intruder. Eventually, the officers exchanged looks, their expressions polite but filled with doubt. Without any evidence, without a witness's account, there was precious little they could do. The case was soon filed away, classified as a potential false alarm, and after a few days, the town's attention drifted. But Aria's did not. Since that fateful night, she had not uttered a single word. She had ceased playing outdoors, stopped her drawing, stopped responding to anything beyond the most basic of commands. She barely touched her food, barely slept. Serafina had tried everything she could imagine. Her favorite stories, her cherished stuffed rabbit, warm, soothing baths, and gentle bedtime lullabies. But nothing seemed to penetrate the silence. Her daughter was drifting further into that quiet place, further and further from the world that loved her. Even worse, Aria had developed an unshakable ritual. Every single night, long after Serafina had tucked her into bed, the small girl would climb out from beneath her blankets and sit by the window. She would press her forehead against the cool glass, her small fingers clutching the sill, and just stare out into the deep darkness that lay beyond the backyard. Serafina had discovered her the first time purely by chance, waking in the dead of night for a drink of water. She had gently pushed open Aria's bedroom door and found her sitting there, perfectly still, gazing out into the moon-drenched yard with a look on her face that made her mother's blood run cold. "Aria," she had whispered, taking a step closer. The girl had not acknowledged her. She had only continued her vigil, her breathing slow and even, her tiny hands clenched into tight fists. Serafina had carried her back to her bed, tucking her in and stroking her soft hair until she drifted back to sleep. But the very next night, and the night after that, she found her there again, watching. At first, Serafina had attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps Arya was simply unable to settle. Perhaps she was waiting for something. Her father, who had never been in their lives, or maybe an answer to a question she could no longer ask. But as the days bled into weeks, the feeling of profound unease only intensified. It wasn't just that Arya watched, it was how she watched, as if she were expecting something to return. The fear began to take root deep in Serafina's soul, a primal dread that defied all explanation. She started to double-check all the locks each night, drawing the curtains shut before bed, leaving the porch light burning even when it did almost nothing to pierce the thick blackness beyond the trees. And still, no matter what she did, the feeling would not leave. The police had already put the case to rest, unwilling to chase a crime that left no trace. Serafina had called them one more time after waking to find the front gate swinging open, though she knew she had secured it the night before. But again, there was nothing to be found. The only person who appeared to take her seriously was Detective Orion Drake. He had been the primary investigator on the night Serafina had reported the incident, and though he had been constrained by the same absence of evidence as his colleagues, something about the case had lingered with him. He visited their house a week later, taking a seat at the kitchen table as Serafina poured him a cup of coffee. He listened with intense focus, watching her with dark, intelligent eyes as she recounted everything that had been happening since that night. "She hasn't spoken a single word," Serafina said, her hands wrapped tightly around her warm mug. "Not so much as a whisper. And she just sits there, staring out the window every night." Drake leaned forward a fraction. "You believe she's looking for something?" Serafina hesitated for a moment. "I believe she's afraid." The detective glanced towards the hallway, where Arya was curled up on the sofa, idly turning the pages of a book she wasn't actually reading. "I know this doesn't make any sense," Serafina admitted, her voice dropping. "But I can feel it, Orion. Something is not right." It wasn't just a feeling. Someone was here that night. Someone was watching her. Drake didn't dismiss her claim. He simply nodded, setting his cup down. "The issue is, without a statement from her, there's only so much I can pursue. If she could just tell us—" "She can't," Serafina interrupted, shaking her head. "She won't." Drake let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand across his jaw. He looked back at Arya, his expression thoughtful. "Have you thought about therapy? A specialist who handles trauma cases?" "I have," Serafina said. "But she won't engage with them either. They believe she has selective mutism, that it's a response to trauma." Drake nodded slowly, considering this. "Then perhaps words aren't the solution." Serafina frowned. "What are you suggesting?" "There are other ways to help a child feel safe again," he said. "Other ways to help her find her way back." She could hear the gentle weight of his suggestion, and by the week's end she had reached her decision. Serafina had always been meticulous when making choices for Arya. As a single parent, every decision carried an immense weight. Every forward step was carefully weighed against the potential repercussions. She didn't have the freedom of trial and error when it concerned her daughter's safety. But after that conversation with Detective Drake, something settled within her mind, like a stone finding the bottom of a still pond. She had to try something different. Talking was failing. Waiting was failing. And every night that she discovered her daughter seated at the window, silent and still, she felt an ever-deepening chasm of helplessness. The concept of a therapy animal was not something she had ever entertained before, but after dedicating hours to reading articles and research on the subject, she couldn't dismiss the feeling that it might be precisely what Arya needed. Animals possessed a unique ability to connect with people when words could not. They could provide security, stability, and companionship. And maybe, just maybe, a dog could help Arya navigate her way back from whatever shadowy place she had retreated to. A week after her talk with Drake, Serafina made an appointment with a specialized rehabilitation center that trained service dogs for trauma survivors. The center was situated on the town's fringe, a long drive past wide-open fields and thick forests. As she maneuvered into the gravel parking lot, she glanced at Arya in the rearview mirror. The little girl sat quietly in her booster seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze far away. "We're here, sweetheart," Serafina said softly. Arya didn't reply. She never did anymore. Serafina reached back and gave her daughter's small fingers a gentle squeeze, then unfastened her seatbelt and got out of the car. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the center's fenced-in grounds. Several dogs were roaming the large outdoor training area, some engaged in play, others sitting with perfect obedience beside their handlers. A woman in her late 40s with sharp, perceptive eyes and a calm air about her approached them as they stepped onto the front porch of the building. "You must be Serafina," the woman said, extending a firm but welcoming handshake. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Crestwood. We spoke on the phone." Serafina nodded. "Thank you for seeing us." Dr. Crestwood's gaze shifted to Arya, her expression softening immediately. She didn't attempt to engage the child in conversation, didn't stoop down and use a high-pitched voice as so many well-intentioned people often did. Instead, she simply offered a smile and gestured toward the entrance. "Let's head inside," she said. The interior of the center was spotless and brightly lit, the scent of antiseptic blending with the familiar earthy smell of dogs. Framed photographs adorned the walls, images of children with their therapy dogs, their faces showing everything from quiet trust to unrestrained happiness. "We work with a wide range of cases here," Dr. Crestwood explained, as she guided them down a hallway. "Children with autism, PTSD, anxiety disorders. Some of our dogs are trained specifically for physical challenges, others for emotional support." She paused outside a large room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the training yard. Inside, several dogs were resting on thick orthopedic beds while others followed their handlers through a series of drills. "I know you mentioned on the phone that Arya has selective mutism," Dr. Crestwood continued, casting a brief glance at the little girl who stood silently by her mother's side. "Has she ever shown any interest in animals before?" Serafina paused for a moment. She used to love watching videos of puppies when she was little. "And she had a stuffed dog she took everywhere with her when she was 3. Dr. Crestwood nodded. "That's a positive sign." She pressed a button on the intercom next to the door. A few moments later, another trainer came into the room, leading a large German shepherd on a leash. "This is Shadow," Dr. Crestwood said. "He's a retired K-9 officer." Serafina's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight of the dog. He was magnificent, tall and powerful, his coat a striking blend of deep black and rich tan. A long faded scar traced a path along his flank, a visible mark of his past. He sat with flawless posture, his ears pricked forward, his deep brown eyes calmly surveying the room with a quiet intelligence. "He was injured in the line of duty," Dr. Crestwood went on, took a blade to the side protecting his handler. "He made a full recovery, but the department decided to retire him early. He's been with our program for a year now, working with children who've experienced trauma." Serafina glanced down at Arya, not sure what she would see. The little girl hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, but her eyes were fixed on Shadow. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't shrinking back, and that alone felt like a monumental breakthrough. Dr. Crestwood knelt beside the dog and gave a quiet command. "Stay." Shadow remained perfectly still. His gaze flickered to Arya, but he made no move to approach. Dr. Crestwood turned to the girl. "He's a very good listener," she said gently. "If you ever want him to come closer, all you have to do is hold out your hand." Arya remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, the seconds stretching out. Serafina felt her own heart thumping in her chest as she watched her daughter, waiting, hoping. Then, millimeter by millimeter, Arya lifted her small hand. The motion was tentative, but it was intentional. Dr. Crestwood nodded at Shadow, and the dog took a single, slow step forward, then another, and another. When his warm breath brushed against Arya's palm, she didn't even flinch. She curled her fingers just slightly, just enough to press them into the thick fur on his muzzle. It was the first time Serafina had seen her daughter willingly connect with anything since the night she had found her hiding in the closet. Her throat tightened, and she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. Dr. Crestwood smiled. "That's a good girl, Arya. Shadow likes you." The child said nothing, but she didn't pull her hand away. By the time they left the center, Shadow was sitting peacefully beside Arya in the back seat of the car. The little girl hadn't spoken, hadn't smiled, but something in her presence felt different. And for the first time in a very long time, Serafina felt a tiny flicker of hope. The first night with Shadow in the house, Serafina braced for Arya to withdraw into herself, the way she always did with anything new. Instead, she sat beside him on the living room floor, gently tracing her fingers over the scar on his side. He remained completely still, allowing her to explore the texture of his fur, his ears twitching now and then at the subtle sounds of the house settling. When bedtime arrived, Serafina hesitated at the doorway of her daughter's room, watching as Shadow curled up at the foot of the bed. Arya climbed under the covers, but she didn't immediately turn to face the wall as she usually did. Instead, she lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling, her small hand resting gently against Shadow's flank. For the first time in weeks, she fell asleep without her vigil at the window. Serafina stayed up for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, gazing out into the quiet night. She didn't know if this was the answer, if a dog could truly mend the deep wounds that had taken root in her daughter's heart. But it was something, and right now, something was more than enough. The nights had grown calmer since Shadow's arrival. Serafina still found herself waking in the middle of the night, her body conditioned by weeks of unrelenting stress, expecting to hear the soft creak of Arya slipping from her bed, the quiet pat of her small feet against the floor as she made her way to the window. But now, each time she checked, she found Arya exactly where she had left her, curled up beneath her blanket, her small hand resting against the thick fur of the German shepherd sleeping by her side. It should have been a source of comfort, a clear sign that things were improving, and for a little while, Serafina allowed herself to believe they were. Arya still had not spoken, but she no longer recoiled at sudden sounds. She ate more, although still in small, deliberate bites, and she no longer pulled away when Serafina reached for her. More than anything, it was the way she touched Shadow that gave Serafina hope, the way she would let her fingers tangle in his fur, as if to ground herself, the way she would press her face against his side when she thought no one was watching. Some days, Serafina would find her sitting on the floor beside him, drawing. The pictures were always the same: Arya and Shadow standing together in the yard. No words, no scenery, just the two of them. But something about them felt strong, unbroken. For the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of progress. Then, a week after Shadow's arrival, Serafina was jolted awake by the sound of a low growl. She sat up in bed, her pulse accelerating. The house was silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the wind against the trees outside. The growl came again, deep and unwavering, vibrating through the floorboards. Shadow. Serafina pushed back the covers, her bare feet meeting the cold hardwood as she moved into the hallway. The door to Arya's room was open just a crack, but it was enough. She moved with caution, the air thick with a sense of unease. As she reached the doorway, she saw the silhouette of her daughter standing by the window, her small frame outlined by the soft glow of the street lamp outside. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't moving. Shadow stood beside her, his body rigid, his fur bristling along his spine. His ears were pricked forward, his posture stiff and alert. His growl was soft but constant, a warning rumbling deep in his chest. Serafina followed his gaze to the window, her heart lodging itself in her throat. A figure stood at the edge of the yard. It was just a shadow, barely visible in the faint light, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was there, just beyond the fence, standing perfectly still, watching. For one terrifying moment, Serafina felt completely paralyzed. Then instinct seized control. She lunged for the bedside lamp, flicking it on. The instant the light flooded the room, the shadow outside reacted. It was fast, too fast, vanishing into the darkness, swallowed completely by the night. Shadow barked, a sharp, commanding sound that sent a shudder down Serafina's spine. Arya flinched but didn't move. She was still staring at the empty yard, her expression impossible to read. Serafina rushed forward, pulling her away from the window, her hands trembling. "Arya, sweetheart, are you okay?" Arya didn't respond. Her breathing was slow and measured, but her eyes, those deep, dark eyes, were locked on the spot where the figure had stood. Serafina turned, her heart racing as she reached for her phone, her fingers unsteady as she dialed. The police arrived 15 minutes later. By then the yard was empty. No footprints in the grass, no signs of forced entry, nothing but the lingering weight of something unseen, something that had been there but left no trace. The responding officers did their best to be reassuring. They searched the perimeter, checked the locks, and shined their lights into the dense trees that bordered the back of the property. But in the end, it was the same as before. No evidence, no proof, just Serafina's word and Aria's silence. Detective Drake arrived last. He took one look at Serafina's face and sighed. "Tell me everything." She told him every detail. The sound of Shadow's growl, the figure at the edge of the yard, the way it had vanished the moment she switched on the light. Drake listened without interruption, his eyes flicking briefly to Aria, who sat on the couch with Shadow at her feet, her hands buried deep in his fur. "Did you see anything else?" Drake asked. Serafina shook her head. "It was too dark." The detective exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not much to go on, but it's something." Serafina pressed. "It means they're coming back." Drake didn't argue. Instead, he pulled a notepad from his pocket and scribbled something down. "I'm going to install a security camera," he said. "If someone's watching this house, I want to see who it is." Serafina nodded, her throat tight. By the time the officers left, it was nearly 3 in the morning. She locked the doors twice, checked the windows 3 times. When she finally crawled into bed, exhaustion pressing down on her, she listened to the sound of Shadow's breathing through the baby monitor she had set up in Aria's room. For the first time since he had arrived, she was grateful beyond words that he was there. The next morning, Aria was different. She wasn't distraught. She wasn't crying. But there was something in the way she held herself that made Serafina uneasy. She ate her breakfast in silence, her gaze flickering to the window every few moments. When Serafina reached out to touch her shoulder, she didn't pull away, but she didn't relax into the touch either. After breakfast, she pulled out her crayons and a sheet of paper. Serafina watched as she began to draw. At first it looked like any other picture. Aria and Shadow. Then slowly the shapes began to change. Behind them, a dark figure materialized. A shadow standing at the edge of the yard, watching. Serafina swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Shadow, who had been lying beside Aria's chair, lifted his head. He was watching too. Outside, the sun was shining. The sky was clear, but somewhere beyond the trees, something or someone was waiting. And Serafina knew with a sickening certainty that this wasn't over. The camera was installed the following day. Detective Drake arrived with a technician, a quiet man with a lean frame who worked efficiently, mounting the small, discreet device above the front door. Another was positioned at the back of the house, aimed toward the yard. Serafina watched from the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Motion activated," Drake explained as the technician fine-tuned the settings. "It'll record anything that moves within 30 feet. If someone returns, we'll get them on tape." Serafina nodded, though it did little to soothe the knot of tension coiled in her stomach. Drake glanced toward the house, his eyes briefly resting on the window where Aria had stood the night before. She wasn't there now, but he knew just as well as Serafina did that the image of her standing in that dim light, staring into the blackness, wasn't one either of them would forget soon. "Try to carry on as usual," he said. "Don't let her see how worried you are." Serafina let out a short breath. "I'm not sure she sees much of anything these days." Drake said nothing. They both knew the truth. Aria saw more than she ever let on. That night, Serafina double-checked the locks again, moving from door to door in a silent ritual. She closed the curtains tightly, then lingered outside Aria's bedroom door. Through the small opening, she could see the soft glow of her daughter's nightlight. The shape of Shadow curled at the foot of the bed, his ears twitching at every minor sound. It felt safe. She wanted to believe it was safe, but deep down she knew it wasn't. She tried to sleep, but the weight of anticipation kept her awake. The house was quiet, except for the occasional groan of settling wood and the distant hum of cicadas outside. Every small noise made her heart leap. She lay there for hours, listening, waiting. At some point, exhaustion claimed her. She drifted off, her dreams a swirl of uneasy, indistinct shapes moving in the dark. Then suddenly a noise, a sharp, guttural bark. Serafina bolted upright. Shadow. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she threw off the covers and ran to the hallway. The door to Arya's room was open again, just as it had been the night before. Shadow stood at the window, his body rigid, his stance protective. He was growling, deep and threatening, his teeth bared, his fur bristled along his spine. Arya was beside him, her small hand gripping his collar. Serafina barely registered herself moving. She reached them in seconds, following the dog's intense gaze to the yard. There, a dark figure, standing just beyond the reach of the porch light, watching. Everything inside Serafina went cold. She moved without thinking, reaching for the lamp, flooding the room with light. The shadow moved, but this time it didn't vanish immediately. For a split second, the figure paused, a fraction of a moment where Serafina swore she saw its head tilt, watching them, observing. Then it was gone, vanishing into the trees. Shadow lunged forward, barking furiously, his body taut with restrained energy. He wanted to give chase, wanted to run, but Arya's grip tightened on his collar, holding him back. Serafina grabbed her daughter, pulling her away from the window, shielding her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the phone, her breath coming in fast, shallow gasps. Drake answered on the second ring. "He's back!" The words came out hoarse, barely a whisper. "I'm on my way." The call ended. The police arrived even faster this time. A sweep of the area, flashlights cutting through the dark shadows stretching across the yard. But just like before, there was nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry. Just absence. Just the cold impression of something unseen slipping away before it could be caught. Drake stood on the porch, hands on his hips, his expression unreadable. He had watched the security footage, had seen the figure lingering just beyond the fence, but it wasn't enough. The image was too dark, too grainy. "He's testing you," Drake said finally, "seeing how far he can push before you break." Serafina swallowed. "What do I do?" Drake looked back at the house. Shadow was sitting at Arya's feet, his eyes still locked on the yard. The girl stood with one hand buried in his fur, the other holding something tightly against her chest. A piece of paper. Drake frowned. "What's that?" Serafina glanced at her daughter, then carefully pried the drawing from her fingers. Her stomach clenched. It was another picture. Arya and Shadow. The yard, the window, and the shadow. But this time, there was something new, a detail that hadn't been there before. The figure had a hand, and on that hand, a long, jagged scar. Serafina's grip on the paper tightened. Drake leaned in, his voice low. "She remembers." For the first time since it all began, something shifted. Not just fear, not just helplessness. Something solid, something real. A clue. And Serafina knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The drawing sat on the kitchen table between them. The colors were stark against the white paper. Black for the shadowed figure, brown and tan for Shadow, bright yellow for the porch light that illuminated the scene. But it was the scar that held Serafina's attention. It was long, jagged, cutting across the figure's hand like a permanent reminder of something unfinished, something left behind. Drake studied it silently, his fingers tapping against the worn edge of the table. His face revealed nothing, but Serafina knew that this was more than just another vague image from a child's imagination. Arya remembered something, and if she remembered it, then it meant that there was a history to this. A connection that went beyond some faceless intruder lurking in their yard. When had she seen that scar before? Drake finally exhaled, straightening. "We need to pursue this. If she's recalling details, it means something is starting to break through." Serafina looked toward the living room, where Arya sat on the floor with Shadow, her fingers absently combing through his fur. The dog lay perfectly still, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. He had become her anchor, her constant. "How do we get her to tell us more?" Serafina asked. "She won't talk. She won't even try." Drake hesitated. "She might not talk," he said carefully, "but she's still communicating." Serafina followed his gaze to the table, the drawing. The answer wasn't in words. It was in what Arya could show them. The next day, Serafina sat with her daughter at the kitchen table. sliding a fresh sheet of paper toward her along with a box of crayons. Arya glanced at her, then at Shadow, who sat beside her chair like a silent guardian. Her small fingers hovered over the crayons before she finally picked up the black one. She started to draw. At first, it was the same as before. Her, Shadow, the yard, the figure standing at a distance. But then she added something new, a van. Serafina swallowed hard. It was parked near the curb, slightly tilted, as if captured in motion. The windows were dark, but Arya had drawn something inside. A shape, a person. Serafina leaned in, her heart pounding. "Sweetheart," she murmured, keeping her voice soft, steady. "Who is that?" Arya didn't look up. She didn't speak. But she picked up the red crayon and carefully colored the sleeve of the person's jacket red, the same color she had used for the scar. Serafina's pulse roared in her ears. Drake arrived within the hour. He sat at the table studying the drawing while Arya sat on the floor beside Shadow. Her back turned slightly, as if she didn't want to be part of this discussion, but couldn't bring herself to leave. "A van," Drake murmured, more to himself than to Serafina. He traced a finger lightly over the sketch, his expression tightening. "We might be able to use this." "How?" Serafina asked, her voice hoarse. If she remembers the scar and the van, then this isn't just someone watching her now. It's someone she's seen before, possibly someone who was there that night. The words settled over the room like a weight. Drake leaned forward. There was a case last year, different part of the state, but the same pattern. A man in a van, a little girl went missing from her backyard. No signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind. Serafina's throat tightened. "Did they find her?" Drake hesitated, and that was all the answer she needed. He sat back, rubbing his jaw. "We need more," he admitted. "The drawing is something, but we need something concrete." Serafina looked at Arya. "What if she can't give us anything else?" Drake was quiet for a long moment, then softly he said, "She already has." That night, Serafina barely slept. The van, the scar, the faceless shape in the shadows. She lay awake, listening to the sound of Shadow's breathing, listening for anything outside the window. She knew now that whoever was out there wasn't just some random intruder. They were connected to Arya's past, and they weren't finished yet. The next morning, she found another drawing. Arya had left it on the kitchen table, neatly placed beside her breakfast plate. Serafina's hands shook as she picked it up. It was different from the others. It wasn't the yard, it wasn't the house. It was the inside of a van. Shadow sat beside her, watching, waiting. Serafina took a shaky breath and reached for her phone. It was time to end this. The drawing of the van haunted Serafina for the rest of the day. It wasn't just another vague image from Arya's mind. It was specific. The details were sharp. The dashboard, the shape of the seats, the way the windows had been darkened from the inside. Arya hadn't just seen that van from a distance. She had been inside it. The realization sent a shiver through Serafina's spine. She knew now that the man watching their house wasn't a stranger to Arya. He wasn't just someone passing by or testing their defenses. He was part of her past. The past she had buried so deep that it had stolen her voice. He had been in her life before, and for some reason, he had come back. Drake arrived not long after Serafina's call, his expression tight with something close to urgency. He placed the drawing on the table in front of him, tracing a slow finger over the lines. The details were disturbingly accurate. "She remembers more than she's letting on," he said, his voice thoughtful. "The layout of the van, the positioning of the seats, this isn't just a vague recollection. This is real?" Serafina swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Drake leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "We find the van." The search began immediately. Drake put out an alert for any vehicles matching the description. A dark-colored van, possibly with custom-tinted windows. He pulled old case files looking for similar reports. As he worked, Serafina watched from across the room, her nerves raw. Arya sat quietly on the floor with Shadow, her small fingers buried in his thick fur. She hadn't reacted to the discussion, hadn't shown any signs that she was listening. But Serafina knew better. That night, sleep did not come easily. Serafina lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house settling, the rustling of the wind outside. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound magnified. She had taken to keeping the curtains closed at all times, but she still felt the presence beyond them, the knowing. Sometime past midnight, Shadow lifted his head. He was awake in an instant, his ears pricked, his body tense. Serafina sat up, her breath catching in her throat. A noise. A soft scuffing sound, like footsteps against gravel. Shadow let out a low growl, deep and warning. Serafina moved quickly. She grabbed her phone, her hands steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. She flipped through the security app and pulled up the live camera feed. A figure moved past the fence, not lingering this time, not watching, walking away, leaving. Serafina's heart pounded in her chest. Whoever it was, they weren't just watching anymore. They had come closer. They had been near the house, close enough for Shadow to sense them. And now they were leaving. But why? She dialed Drake, her voice low and controlled as she explained what had happened. He arrived at the house within minutes, his car rolling silently to a stop in front of the driveway. He checked the yard, his flashlight sweeping over the grass, the fence line. There were faint impressions in the dirt, the kind left by careful, measured steps. He wasn't just standing here, Drake murmured. He was looking for something. Or someone. The thought chilled Serafina. The next morning, Drake called with an update. They had found a van matching the description on a traffic camera 2 towns over. It was registered to a man named Silas Croft, a delivery driver with a record of petty theft and trespassing. But that wasn't what caught Serafina's attention. It was the photo attached to his file. His hand, the scar. Serafina felt her stomach twist. This was him. The man in Arya's drawings. The man who had been in their yard. The man who had, at some point, taken her daughter. Drake's voice was grim. "We're moving in." The search led them to a cabin on the outskirts of the next county, nestled deep within the woods. It was an old place, its walls weathered, its roof sagging in places, the kind of place that went unnoticed, forgotten. But something about it was wrong. Shadow felt it first. The moment they stepped out of the car, his posture changed. His tail went stiff, his ears flattened. He growled, the sound low and constant. Drake exchanged a look with his team. They moved in carefully. The front door was locked, but a side window had been left open, just enough to suggest that someone had been careless or confident. The inside was sparse, an old table, a cot, a scattering of empty food cans, but then Drake noticed something else. A wooden floorboard, slightly raised at the edge. His pulse quickened. He knelt, pressing his fingers against the seam. It was loose. With a quiet nod to his team, he lifted it. A staircase leading down. The air shifted as they descended. It was damp, stale, and then a sound. Soft, faint breathing. Drake's flashlight swept across the basement. The walls were lined with shelves, old tools, rusted cans of paint. But in the farthest corner, half hidden in the shadows, a girl. Her clothes were torn, her skin pale, her eyes wide with fear. She had been chained at the ankle, but the lock was weak. Drake moved quickly, unlocking the shackle, lifting her gently. "Clara Monroe," he breathed. The girl who had gone missing 6 months ago. Alive. Serafina stood at the top of the stairs, frozen. Shadow sat beside her, still as stone. She looked at the child, then at Drake, and back down the dark staircase. The pieces were falling into place, and she knew deep in her bones it wasn't just about Arya anymore. The courtroom was packed, rows of spectators lining the wooden benches, whispering among themselves, their voices hushed but electric with curiosity. The case had gripped the town, spilling beyond the quiet boundaries of their community, and making its way into regional news. Everyone wanted to see the man who had stolen children. Everyone wanted to witness justice being served. Serafina sat at the front with Arya beside her. The small girl pressed close, her fingers curled tightly into the thick fur of Shadow, who lay obediently at her feet. The dog remained motionless, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room as if searching for unseen threats. He was a presence of steady strength, a guardian in the midst of chaos. On the other side of the room, Silas Croft sat at the defense table, his face impassive, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He wore the same unremarkable expression he had the day of his arrest, as though none of this touched him. But Serafina could see it. The tightness in his fingers, the occasional flicker of his jaw as he clenched his teeth. He was nervous, and he should be. The prosecutor, Isabel Rain, rose to deliver her opening statement. She was sharp and methodical, her tone measured but firm. She painted a picture of Croft's crimes, the months of stalking, the meticulous planning, the moment he had taken Clara Monroe from her home in the dead of night. The fact that he had returned to watch Aria to ensure his secrets remained buried. When she spoke about Clara, the girl's parents, seated a few rows behind Serafina, let out a quiet sob. Clara herself was not present today. Her doctors had determined she was not ready to face her captor, but her statement had been recorded. A haunting recounting of cold, damp walls and whispered threats in the dark. Croft's defense attorney, a stiff, gray-suited man named Donovan Finch, stood next. His approach was clear. Discredit the evidence. Paint his client as a victim of circumstance. He argued that the security footage was inconclusive, that the drawings were a child's imagination running wild, that Clara Monroe's testimony was unreliable after months of trauma. But Serafina wasn't worried. She had seen Croft's face when they found Clara, the slight widening of his eyes, the minute twitch of his hands. He knew it was over. The trial moved quickly. Witnesses were called. Drake, who described the investigation in detail. The forensic expert who confirmed Croft's DNA on the chains found in the basement. The officer who had arrested him. But when it was time for Aria to take the stand, the room shifted. A hush fell over the courtroom as Serafina led her daughter forward. Aria's small fingers never left Shadow's fur, her grip tightening as they reached the witness stand. The judge, an older man with wise eyes, allowed Shadow to sit beside her, understanding the importance of his presence. Isabel Rain approached cautiously, her voice gentle. "Aria, sweetheart, do you remember why we're here today?" Aria did not speak. She only nodded, her dark eyes flickering to the man across the room. "Can you tell us if you've seen this man before?" Isabel gestured toward Croft. Aria didn't answer with words. Instead, she lifted her arm, her small finger pointing directly at him. The reaction was immediate. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Croft's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection! The child has been repeatedly exposed to images of my client before the trial. This identification is unreliable." The judge raised a hand for silence. "Overruled." "Continue, Miss Rain." Isabel crouched slightly, keeping her voice soft. "Aria, did this man ever talk to you?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Aria's breathing was shallow. Her fingers curled tightly into Shadow's fur. Then, barely noticeable, her hand twitched. A subtle movement. But Shadow understood. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward, his muscles tensing beneath Serafina's hand. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Not aggressive, but firm. A reaction. A recognition. The room stilled. Croft stiffened, his knuckles whitening against the table. Isabel saw it. So did the jury. The growl deepened, a sound of certainty, of warning, of truth. Shadow knew. Croft shifted, his composure cracking, his leg bouncing beneath the table. His fingers tapped against the polished wood. He was unraveling. Isabel turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Detective Drake to the stand for follow-up testimony." Drake approached, taking his place with the ease of a man who had spent years in courtrooms. Isabel wasted no time. "Detective, has this animal ever encountered the defendant before?" Drake shook his head. "Not to my knowledge." "Then why would he react to him now?" Drake glanced at Shadow, who was still fixated on Croft. "Because dogs don't forget." A shudder rippled through the gallery. The tension in the room thickened as Isabel turned back to the defense table. "Mr. Croft, do you have an explanation for why this animal recognizes you?" For the first time, he looked cornered. His attorney leaned in, whispering furiously, but Croft didn't respond. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked painful. Serafina could see it. The sweat beading on his forehead, the way his fingers curled against his palms. He knew it was over. The next day, he changed his plea. Guilty. The courtroom erupted, a rush of relief, of grief, of justice settling into place. Serafina sat frozen, Shadow pressing against her leg, his warmth grounding her. Beside her, Aria inhaled slowly, and then, for the first time in months, she whispered, "Thank you." The days following the trial passed in a blur. The town moved on quickly, as small towns always did, But for Serafina, the weight of what had happened lingered. The house no longer felt like a place haunted by unseen shadows, yet a certain silence remained. A different kind of quiet, not the oppressive, fearful kind that had settled in after that night a month ago, but the kind that came after a storm, a hush of rebuilding, of healing. Silas Croft had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. His final moment in the courtroom played over in Serafina's mind. The way his shoulders slumped as the realization sank in. The way his eyes darted to Aria before the guards led him away. But it no longer mattered. He was gone. The threat was over. Yet Serafina couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. Aria had spoken in the courtroom. It had been a whisper, barely audible, but it had been real. It had been hers. Since then, Serafina had listened, waiting to hear her daughter's voice again, but the words had not come back. The house was different now. The locks had been replaced, new security measures put in place. The windows no longer held Aria captive at night. She no longer sat pressed against the glass, waiting for the figure in the dark. But she still didn't speak. Instead, she clung to Shadow. The German shepherd never left her side. He followed her from room to room, his presence an unspoken reassurance. She fed him now, filling his bowl every morning with careful hands, watching as he ate. She brushed his fur, took long naps curled up beside him on the couch, and she drew. The drawings changed, too. At first, they had been filled with shadows, dark figures at the edge of the page, small, frightened shapes in the foreground. Then, slowly, they had begun to shift. The shadows faded. The figures became brighter, clearer. The last picture Serafina found pinned to the fridge had been different from all the others. It was a drawing of Aria standing beside Shadow, but this time she was smiling. Serafina held on to that. Days passed. The nightmares came less frequently. Aria still woke up some nights shaking, clinging to Shadow, but the silent terror had faded from her eyes. She no longer froze when someone knocked on the door. She no longer stiffened when Serafina left the room. She was healing. One evening, Serafina found herself sitting on the back porch, a cup of tea in her hands as she watched Aria in the yard. The sun was setting, the sky painted in soft pinks and oranges. The girl was sitting cross-legged on the grass, watching as Shadow rolled lazily onto his back, his paws twitching. It was peaceful. Serafina exhaled, letting herself feel that peace. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself that. Then she heard it. Soft, quiet, but unmistakable. Laughter. She turned sharply, her heart slamming against her ribs. Aria was laughing. It wasn't loud, wasn't the carefree giggle Serafina remembered from before, but it was real. It was hers. Tears stung Serafina's eyes as she set her cup down, rising slowly, not wanting to startle the moment away. Shadow had rolled onto his feet now, his tail wagging as he stared at Aria, tongue lolling out. The girl reached forward, ruffling his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Serafina's breath caught. She hadn't imagined it. Aria had spoken. The words were soft, fragile, as if testing themselves for the first time in months. But they were there. The air around them shifted. Aria looked up, meeting Serafina's gaze. Something passed between them. An understanding. A moment of shared relief. Then slowly, carefully, Aria stood. She padded over to where Serafina stood, frozen on the porch, her small hands fidgeting at her sides. Serafina knelt, leveling herself with her daughter, waiting. Aria hesitated for a long moment, then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "I missed you." The words shattered something inside Serafina. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight, her throat closing against the sob that threatened to break free. "I missed you too, baby," she murmured into her hair. She felt Aria exhale against her. A slow, steady release, as if letting go of something heavy. And then, finally, completely, her daughter came back to her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be nightmares. There would still be memories, scars left behind in the quiet spaces between days. But they would face them together. Because now Aria was no longer trapped in silence. She had found her voice again, and she was never letting it go. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Check out other videos for more gripping stories. And don't forget to share this video with others who might enjoy it.